Hi, my name's Mel and welcome back to Bookish Brummy. So for today's video we're going to talk about what I've read for the first week of November. And again, I've had quite a prolific week this week and I've read quite a variety of things as well. So if you were with me last week for my roundup of all the books I'd read in October, I had got 50% of the way through Joe Hill's The Black Phone and Other Stories. Now this book was originally published under 20th Century Ghosts in 2007, but they recovered it and renamed it The Black Phone, and I think this was based on the fact that there was a film released at Halloween in, I want to say 2023, called The Black Phone, so that probably attracted more people to the book who'd recognised the film. And that's exactly what happened to me. I remember seeing the film and that sort of attracted me towards the book. But I'd also had the opportunity to buy this book in book 66 as well, so I got a fairly good discount on it. Now, if anybody was following my Halloween reads, I had read Heart-Shaped Box by Joe Hill, which was his first novel, and I wasn't totally impressed with that book. I felt that it dragged a fair bit in the middle, had a little bit of a problem with the way that he sort of wrote about the women's appearance in it, and wasn't quite happy with the way that he dealt with the mental health aspects in that book. Although I thought the ending was okay, but it didn't rate as highly as I thought it was going to be when I went into the book, especially after reviews I've read about the book with lots of people raving about that book. But as I understand it, Joe Hill did actually start out writing short stories, so I thought, well, I'll go and try some of those, which is what's in this book. So there's 16 short stories in this book, and I was actually really impressed with this book. I had a really good time with this book, really enjoyed reading it, and I'll just say off the bat now that I've rated this a 4.25, because I think it's quite hard to rate a story collection of 5 unless you thoroughly enjoy like every single story in it. I don't think I've ever rated a story collection like a 4 or 5, but a 4.25 is pretty good going. I felt a lot more enthusiastic about these stories, and I thought that there were some really good ones in there. Now, I wouldn't describe the stories in this book as being particularly horror themed. There are obviously some ghost stories in there. It's probably why it was called 20th Century Ghosts in the first place. Plus there's a story in this book called 20th Century Ghosts, so again, named it after one of the short stories. But the stories in here are quirky, like really off the wall. My partner had asked me to describe, you know, the storyline of one of the stories so he could see what I meant, and I described to him the storyline for Pop Art, and he started laughing. And essentially Pop Art is about a blow-up boy who's born to parents who are normal human skin, blood, bone parents, but they've had a son who's made up of blow-up material. And essentially the boy in Pop Art, he's bullied by some people, and he basically has to spend his life not getting punctured. So it's very off the wall, and I really enjoyed that. And there's a big range in here of all kinds of stories, you know. So I would say that my favourite stories in here were Pop Art. There was one called The Cape, which I really enjoyed, which is essentially about a young boy who gets a cape when he's little, and it appears that he can fly with it, but he doesn't really do anything with that until he becomes an adult. But the ending to that story takes a really severely dark turn, and I really enjoyed that one. There's one about a typewriter that I really enjoyed as well, where essentially there is a dead person who continues to type on their typewriter after they've died. And then there was one called Voluntary Committal, which I thought was really good as well, which is basically again about childhood, and these young boys play with boxes and create things out of cardboard boxes. Now, I used to do that when I was a kid. I think that's what attracted me into this story, because I really wanted to see where that was going. I'd say that Joe Hill writes the angle of being a child really well. He can really put himself into the head of like an 8, 10 or 12-year-old boy and really sell that to me as a story. And I'd say a lot of these stories actually are from the viewpoint of a child. So I think he did a really good job. I was really happy with this, and I'm really glad that I picked it up. I'm really glad I gave Joe Hill another chance. So if you like short stories, or you just like stories that are a little bit wacky, off the wall, definitely I would recommend this. And I would read this again, and I would dip in and read different stories again, so I definitely read Pop Art and The Cape again. You know, they're not that long either, so yeah, definitely positive to read that. So the next book that I read after that is probably going to be no surprise to anybody that I picked up Stephen King's Holly. Now, I'd actually said at the start of October that I was really looking forward to getting into this because I'd read all of the other 5 stories that include Holly up to the point of this one. So this was obviously the next logical place that I needed to go before I can get to Never Flinch and read that. But I didn't include it in my Halloween reads because I felt that I should have included more of Stephen King's classics. So I did It and Pet Sematary because they're stereotypically considered to be some scary ones that he has done. However, this was really dark. Like, the subject matter in this, I think it would have fit quite well actually as a Halloween read. You know, it hasn't been as round as long. This was only published, I think it was 2023. Let me just check on that one. So, you know, it hasn't, yeah, 2023 the copyright. So it just hasn't been as round as long as some of these have been around for decades and decades for everybody to rave about. But I definitely thought that the story ending in this was really good. I felt that the story moved along quite well. We follow Holly Gibney, she's the main character in this story. Now, in the previous Holly stories, Holly hasn't always been a main character, she's sort of been a side character along with other characters. But now we're at a point where essentially Holly is running the Finders Keepers detective agency, private detective agency by herself. So this is sort of quite a big case for her to be involved with. But there's also Barbara and Jerome, who sort of feature in the other Holly books as well, are also playing like a main part in here. So they're quite instrumental to, not the case I don't think, but the story on the whole, because I think it would be quite hard to write a book purely about Holly without any of the characters to fall back on, and Holly doesn't really have any family and she doesn't really have any friends like Barbara and Jerome are like her only friends. So I understand why they've been pulled into this story and used. I know some people did complain about Barbara and Jerome being included in this, but I didn't really mind actually, and I think that because they've been on the Holly journey from the start, I kind of expected them to be there. I didn't mind them being there, and I didn't think that they were taking anything away from the story. So yeah, so we basically start off, Holly has a case where she's trying to find Bonnie Dahl, who's been reported missing, but as she starts looking into this disappearance, she starts uncovering disappearances of a lot more people, and this is sort of leading to something more and more sinister, and it just goes beyond being a single missing persons case. So I won't say too much more about the ending because I don't really want to give it away, but it's dark, and you see immediately from the start of the book the people perpetrating these crimes. It's not a secret, you as the reader know who they are, but you don't fully understand why they're doing it at first. This sort of becomes unravelled as the book goes on as well. But you know, you keep having to sort of take a breath and be like, that's just, what? Oh, that's awful. Like, why they're doing that, that's disgusting. So I think from a crime thriller perspective, he did a really, really good job on this novel. And I think from a horror perspective, it is also actually pretty horrifying. I don't often see it classed as a horror, but I would say it's fairly horrifying. Now, the other thing that Stephen King has been criticised for in this book is it's very political. And with regards to politics with Trump, I think he mentions Trump quite a few times in this book. It's not really a surprise in there. He's obviously not promoting Trump in this book, but I think he's got a way of doing it where it's kind of, you know, people who vote Trump in the book bad, people who didn't vote Trump good, and it's probably not that clear cut in real life. So I could understand why that would upset some people. Now, I'm not from America and I do not take part in the American elections, so it doesn't really upset me as much to read that kind of politics in those books, because I don't really feel like Stephen King is having an opinion on me or how I voted. But I do understand why some of the Americans may have been upset by that. The one thing that did really interest me in this book though is the things that he wrote about COVID. So he says that this is actually set in 2020, so the pandemic is in full swing, And obviously the pandemic hit all across the world. Now, Holly's character, the way she is, she's always been super clean and specific about how she likes things to be. She doesn't really like touching strangers, and that's always been in her character. So I did assume that she would, you know, be a frequent hand washer and that she would be super conscious about wearing a mask. And none of that surprised me, and that's exactly what her character's doing in this book. I'd have thought it a bit weird if she wasn't. But again, we do kind of have the whole people who are vaccinated good, people who are not vaccinated bad. And again, I think it's a bit more complicated than that, and I can see again why that might upset people to sort of have this broad brush. I think what bothered me in the book, and it's I haven't been to America in the last few years. I haven't been to America since the pandemic happened, and I wasn't there during the pandemic. But it's not just Holly's character that, you know, Holly's character seems to go around asking any single person that she meets, are you vaccinated? Yes, no, and they have a conversation about what kind of vaccination they'd had and whether they're double vaccinated. You know, and I might expect that of Holly, and if that had just been written into the Holly character, I would have found that a quirk. But no, it seems that every single character in this book, the moment they meet each other, has to establish each other's vaccination status. You know, what type of vaccination that they had. And I'm just wondering, was this actually a thing? Is this what people publicly did in America? Because in the UK, this is not what we did. It was a private matter. People talked about vaccination and the press talked about vaccination, but you wouldn't just walk up to somebody that you just met and start asking them for their vaccination status, or I didn't see that happening or hear of that happening. And even among people who knew each other, who they were friends, people weren't really talking about their vaccination status. It was seen as a bit of a touchy subject. It was a private matter, and it just wasn't up for a public, you know, discussion, debate. Whereas in this book, every character seems to think that this is okay. So I thought I thought it was odd, because as I said, I would have expected this from Holly, but not every other character in the book. You know, so I can't really answer whether that was normal for the Americans or not, but I did find that a bit shocking. From, you know, obviously in the UK, as far as I can see, that just wasn't happening. It did get a bit tiresome as well. I mean, we have not long come out of the pandemic, so it's not something that I particularly want to be reminded of, and it did feel like every other page was banging on about something to do with the pandemic. And I think some of that could have been cut out, because if we didn't have every single character elbow bumping each other and asking about vaccinations, you know, we could have probably got through a couple of chapters without even having to mention the pandemic. Like, we know it's happening during the pandemic. That's pretty clear because Holly's always wearing a face mask. But I don't think that we had to keep having a discussion that frequently throughout the book and then try to paint this group of people bad, this group of people good sort of picture every so often in the book. So I do totally understand why some people maybe didn't like this book or didn't get on with the fact that they felt like certain things were being shoved down their throat. Now, from a story perspective, I thought this was really good. I thought this was really tight as well, concluded really, really well, and I really like the Holly character, and I don't mind Barbara and Jerome, so all of that was good. I enjoyed that. But the constant going on about COVID, and sort of writing the characters in what seemed like a bit of a false situation to me, that they would all be like Holly in that sense, when I didn't see anybody behaving like that here in the UK. That felt a little bit false to me. So in the end, I think, you know, I'm going to give this a 4. I think it's a good solid 4. It may have gone up possibly to like about a 4.5 or 4.75 if we'd not kept banging on about COVID every other page. Now, the only reason that I wouldn't rate this as a 5 is when I go back and think about The Outsider or like Finders Keepers. They were very solidly a 5. I absolutely devoured those books and rushed through them. And whilst this story was good, I didn't have the same, oh, I have to read the next page, I have to read the next page, I have to read the next page. Now, some of that probably was because of the constant pandemic stuff going on in there. So I think it would be unfair to say that it was originally a 5 and that, you know, I was like knocking it down to be like, because I think that it didn't quite make a 5 for me compared to those ones. So yeah, I would give this a 4. It was a good read, but be warned, if you're a bit sensitive to talking about the pandemic, just be wary going into this book, because you might not like that bit. It might be a bit tiresome. So after that, I then went on to read The Safekeep by Yael van der Wouden. Now, I did mention last week that I was going to have to read this one pretty quickly because it's actually my book club's read. We will be discussing this next week, so I had to get through this one as soon as possible, really, so that I have time to digest it before that book club. Now, in our book group, we nominate a couple of books, and then we will go around the room and vote, and then the one that gets the most votes is the one that we pick. And I actually was involved in voting for this one. Now, I voted for it because it is the 2025 Women's Prize for Fiction winner, and I do like the Women's Prize for Fiction books normally. I think, like, I read Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver earlier this year, and it was absolutely outstanding. Whilst, you know, 5, it's like 5 out of 5 normally for a book, I would have given Demon Copperhead a 6. So I'd have given it that extra star if I could, because I thought it was so good. So, you know, the opportunity to read another Women's Prize for Fiction book, I wanted to take that opportunity. Now, I've heard that there were some racy scenes in here before I got into that, but I didn't really read too much into it because I was going to have to read it anyway for book club. It's a Women's Prize for Fiction winner, so it's probably going to be good, so I thought I'll just take it as it comes and see what happens. Now, I'm not against sex in literature at all. I think if it adds to the story in a positive way, fine. But this was, I felt I wasn't sure if I was reading historical literary fiction or soft porn at times. You know, I mean, we start off with this family. We'll start again. So we start off with this family. We have Isabel, who is I think she's like late 20s at this age, or maybe just about to turn 30. And then there's her 2 brothers. There's Hendrik, who is younger than her, and there's Louis, who is older than her. And they have this family home that they all moved to during the tail end of World War II. So they moved from Amsterdam and they move into this house in the country in the east, and when they get there, their mum can't come with them. She has to stay in Amsterdam for a bit, like parents couldn't come until afterwards. And we had this kind of evacuation in the UK as well, so that wasn't a complete surprise to me that that had happened. But there's a couple of odd things that had happened when they were younger, and they didn't really put 2 and 2 together, you know, about like the house already having items in it and things like that. And then essentially the brothers have moved out of the house, and it is just Isabel who's living in the house, and Louis has this new girlfriend called Eva, and Eva is essentially going to be on her own because Louis is going to go away to work for about a month. So he asks Isabel if Eva can come and stay with her. Now, Isabel is a bit of a funny character. It's actually her character that sort of drew me into the book. I thought that, you know, the first 80 pages or so, I was quite captivated because Isabel's really odd, to be honest, and you're thinking to yourself, like, okay, there's got to be a reason why she's like this. And in some parts I could sort of understand her, and in other parts I just thought, wow, she's really over the top, you know. But then Eva moves in, and then that's kind of, I suppose, the middle of the story, like where it kicks off. And I felt, between about 100 and 160 pages, this was a bit of a slog. It suddenly turned from, I'm interested in this character, to this character is now behaving completely the opposite way I would have expected them to at the beginning of the book. And it sort of comes out of nowhere, really. Like, it doesn't really explain like why she's suddenly acting the way she is. There is really graphic scenes of sex in here, and it was a bit much. It was about 60 pages straight of sex, and it was written in a really detailed manner as well, to the point where I felt like the author was writing sound effects that I couldn't get out of my head. So for for that. Yeah, they did a good job in writing it. If they want to go off and write pornography or something, I feel that this author would probably be well qualified to do that based on what I read in here. But it was just a bit much. Like I really don't like that to that extent in what I'm reading. And if I wasn't reading this for book group, I probably would have DNF'd it. I wouldn't have got to the end of the book, which would have been a shame. So I clung on, kept reading. I thought, well, this, you know, it's got to change somewhere. It's got to mean something. And we get like then to the third part, like the third act of the book, I would say. And it suddenly turns again, you know, and I got to a point where I was flagging with this, thinking, you know, I'm really not enjoying this. This is unusual for a Women's Prize for Fiction winner. And then suddenly it changes again, and it starts going into basically the twist in the story, which I'm not going to reveal that obviously because that would spoil it for you. But the twist is really interesting. It's sad, and I think, you know, it's what makes it historical fiction in the sense like what they're talking about. And I think that the subject matter that they're talking about is really, really important. I think it's important that some way it gets recognised, even if it's through a fiction text, because, you know, it did happen, it did really happen, and not just in the Netherlands, but in some other countries as well. So I commend the author for finding a way to write about that. And, you know, after I'd got over that 60 pages of what seemed to be pure sex, and then got back into the end of that book and that historical part of it, where I was captivated again then, and I was invested to finish to the end, you know. And I might not have got to that bit, and I think that's what gets me. I think that this is quite an important book. It's got an important message. You know, it's about an important thing that happened in history, and if going down the fiction route is a way to get people to read about that and consume that, then that's a good thing. But I almost didn't get there because of the straight sex in the middle, which I thought, thinking about it now, you know, I've been thinking about it for a few days since I finished it. I'm not sure to that graphic level of detail was really required for the author to move the story to the place where they wanted to move it. I just don't think it was necessary. So I've got to be honest, I'm going to give this a 3.5, because I criticised Joe Hill during his, when I was reading Heart Shaped Box, and said, you know, I shouldn't have to spend 100 pages thinking, this is a struggle, why am I reading this? And yet I'm spending 60 pages in this book, and this book is 260 odd pages long. So, you know, for 60 pages of that, I'm struggling to get through it and not wanting to get through it. So, you know, I have to really deduct some points, I think, for the fact that that was happening. And I don't actually think that the sex to that degree gave anything to the book. However, I would say that if that doesn't really bother you in a book, then I would recommend this as a read, as I said, because of the importance of the book, I would say. And it's, you know, it is a Women's Prize for Fiction winner. There's obviously a lot of other people out there that have really, really enjoyed this. But if you don't like reading about sex in fiction, then this one is not for you. So then after the safekeep, I did manage to get hold of the third book of Dust, The Rosefield by Philip Pullman. So I would say, I think I'm about 35 to 40% through the book. I only started it the other day, so I won't really be able to review this properly until we have our next catch up on things that I've read. But so far I'm really, really enjoying it. I was really happy when I received this because I have been following Lyra's story for, you know, the last 3 decades that Philip Pullman has been writing it, and this is like the conclusion to the second trilogy that he's written on Lyra. And I listened to the other Book of Dust books earlier this year, La Belle Sauvage and The Secret Commonwealth, so I'm quite up to date with the story at the moment, hence I don't want to leave this lying around to forget what happened. I just want to get straight into it. And again, this would be no surprise that I picked this up and started reading it, because I've been raving about how for the last week or maybe two weeks that, you know, I want to get into this as soon as possible. So, you know, we've done quite well this week. We did 3 books overall, so like 2 full books, finished half of one book, and then almost got to half of another book. So I would say that that's pretty good. good going for the week. And I've read like quite a variety of things, you know. We've had like thriller, horror, we've had historical literary fiction, some bit of fantasy with Philip Pullman. You know, I'd say with Joe Hill's a kind of, I wouldn't say horror fantasy, but I guess some of them are a little bit horror fantasy, gothic fantasy maybe, and then, you know, we've had like crime, thriller, horror with Stephen King, so really good variation this week, and I've enjoyed myself. If any of you have read any of the books that I've read this week and have any opinions on them, or want to talk about my opinions on them, please leave a message down in the comments. I welcome the discussion. And I'm especially interested to see what everybody else has to say about the Safekeep. As I am going to be discussing this at my book club group next week, so we'll find out what they have to say about it as well. Now, normally the next catch-up would have been, I think it would have been on Friday the 15th or Saturday the 16th of, no, Saturday the 15th or Friday the 14th of November. It would have been one of those 2 days, because then we would have had an extra week from here for me to give you an update. But I'm not so sure that I'm going to be able to do that update next week, because I'm really incredibly busy after I finish work on Friday for that whole weekend. So I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to film anything and put it up with regards to reviewing what I've read. So I'm going to move our next catch up to 17th November on the Monday. But I think that that works out quite well, because the end of the month is going to be on a Sunday anyway, so we would have done the final roundup on a Monday, so just giving myself an extended week on this week rather than at the end of the month. But I am still posting some videos next week. So next Wednesday on the 12th of November, I've done a summary of Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice, which was a book I read during the spooky season. And I really enjoyed it. It was my favourite book of all the books that I read. So I thought that that warranted going into a few more details about it. So that'll be coming next Wednesday. And I will still post a video next Friday or Saturday. It just won't be a review of what I've just read this week, but I'm thinking to review maybe 5 stars that I've had this year, like before I've started the channel, because I've read like loads of really good books this year. So I'm sure that we can talk about something like that really. Now, I did mention last week that I was trying to cross off some reading points on a list that I'd set myself, so I'm just going to put that on the screen now. And I had said that the Safekeep would cover off the Women's Prize for Fiction one. However, I've decided not to use this for the Women's Prize for Fiction point. I've decided to use it for the Enemies to Lovers, because this is an Enemies to Lovers story. And the romance genre is not really my thing, so it's quite difficult for me to cross off the, I think there's a romance and an enemies to lovers point on this list. It's going to be quite difficult for me to cross those off. So as I've actually now read this, and this very clearly does fulfill enemies to lovers, I'm going to use this to cover off that point, because I do have other books in my collection that I could cover off Women's Prize for Fiction winner. That I'd actually be excited to read, so I'd rather do that. None of the other books I read crossed off any of the other points, so at this point, out of, I think we had 15 to cross off, and we've managed to cross off 1 after our first week of reading in November. Anyway, it's been lovely to catch up with you, and I will see you on the next one. Bye!